Hello. I got my buddy today. Here's Finn again behind me. We're in my basement. So today I just decided to just put some hay down on the floor, and he'll clean it up for me. He'll eat all of it. So he's gonna listen to my story today. He likes when I read, so this will be a nice little visit with him as well. So the last chapter I read was called What? And if you remember, I had to read it and then read it backwards. It was crazy. So today I'm going to start by reading The Substitute. I'm not sure what to think about that substitute teacher. Her eyebrows look a little bit mean, a little bit weird. But all the kids are raising their hands, so, okay, The Substitute. Benjamin couldn't take it any longer. Today was the day he would finally tell Mrs. Jules his real name. So what if nobody likes me, he thought. So what if I stop getting high marks? Hi, Mark, said Jason. Hi, Mark, said Stephen. Hi, he said grimly, then started up the stairs. Hi, Mark, said Bebe as he took his seat next to her. Guess what? We have a substitute. Yahoo! Shouted Mauricia. Everyone in Mrs. Jules' class loved it when they had substitute teachers. They loved playing mean and horrible tricks on them. Benjamin frowned. He finally had the courage to tell Mrs. Jules his real name. Rats, he said. That's a great idea, said Terence. We'll put dead rats in her desk. Let's trick her into going outside, said Joy. Then lock her out of the room. But what if she tells Mr. Kidswatter, asked Eric Fry. So what, said Joy. She'll have to go all the way down to the office and then all the way back up. And by then, we'll unlock the door. Mr. Kidswatter will think she's bonkers. Benjamin looked at the substitute teacher sitting at Mrs. Jules' desk. She looked like a nice lady. She wore tiny spectacles. Do you know what spectacles are? Glasses. She wore tiny spectacles and had long gray hair tied into a ponytail. He felt sorry for her. He felt sorry for himself. I was going to tell Mrs. Jules my name, he thought. I really was. The substitute stood up and walked to the center of the room. Good morning, she said. My name is Mrs. Franklin. Nobody said good morning back to her. Calvin handed Benjamin a note. At 10 o'clock, drop your book on the floor. Pass it on, was what the note said. Benjamin read it, then passed it on to Todd. Okay, who can tell me what page we're on? Asked Mrs. Franklin. Page 17, called Myron. 112, said Mauricia. 98, said Eric Ovens. 3,000, said Joe. Mrs. Franklin smiled. I guess we'll have to study all those pages, she said. Benjamin raised his hand. Yes, the handsome man in the red shirt, said the substitute. He told her the correct page. We're on page 102, he said. Thank you, said the substitute. And what is your name, please? Benjamin thought a moment. He looked around the room. Then boldly, he told the truth. My name is Benjamin, he stated proudly. Several kids snickered. Thank you, Benjamin, said the substitute. There were more snickers. Snickers? We know what those are, right? Giggles, because his name isn't Benjamin in the class, so they think that he's making up a name. Oh, Mrs. Franklin asked a question from page 102. Jason answered it correctly. Very good, said the substitute. And what is your name? She asked him. Jason looked around. Benjamin, he said out loud, and the whole class giggled. Thank you, Benjamin, said Mrs. Franklin. The other half giggled. Dana answered the next question. And what's your name, Mrs. Franklin asked Dana. Benjamin, Dana blurted out, then fell giggling onto the floor. Thank you, Benjamin, said the substitute. Everyone was hysterical. My, it is a certainly pleasure to teach such a happy class, said the substitute. Who knows the answer to question 4? They all raised their hands. They all wanted to tell the substitute their names were Benjamin. They were having so much fun they forgot to drop their books at 10 o'clock. At recess, everyone congratulated Benjamin on his great trick. You're a genius, Mark, said Todd. Benjamin is a funny name, said Jason. How'd you ever think of it? But my name really is Benjamin, said Benjamin. So is mine, said Stephen. Mine too, said Leslie. They all laughed. Do you think she really believes we're all named Benjamin? Asked Eric Ovens. Probably, said Joy. If she thought we were lying, bless you, she would have gotten mad, said Eric Bacon. The bell rang and they all hurried back to class. After recess was social studies. Who would like to read? Asked Mrs. Franklin. Every hand went up. Okay, Benjamin, said Mrs. Franklin as she pointed at Dana. Everyone laughed. Dana giggled a few seconds, then got control of herself and read from the book. Thank you, Benjamin, said the substitute when Dana was finished. Okay, Benjamin, you read the next, she said, pointing at Terrence. Everyone laughed. It was the first time all year Terrence had volunteered to read. All day, everyone paid very close attention. They all wanted the teacher to call on them. Because as funny as it was when Mrs. Franklin called somebody else Benjamin, it was even funnier when she called you Benjamin. So everybody worked hard and listened closely. As a result, they learned more from the substitute teacher in a day than they usually learned from Mrs. Jules in a month. And when the bell rang, everyone crowded around her desk. Are you coming back tomorrow, Mrs. Franklin? Asked Eric Bacon. Please, Mrs. Franklin, say you will, pleaded Kathy. You're the best substitute teacher we've ever had. The substitute smiled. School is over, she said. You don't have to call me Mrs. Franklin anymore. That sounds so formal. Since we're friends now, you can call me by my first name. What is your first name? Asked Mauricia. The substitute gathered up her things and put them in her straw bag. It's Benjamin, she said, then walked out of the room. Everyone stared silently after her. Do you think that's really her name? Asked Joy. All right, chapter 19 is called A Bad Case of the Sillies. And I'll keep on going as long as he's being good. Huffin, you being a good boy? Huh? You being a good boy? Yes. Okay. A Bad Case of the Sillies. Looks like there's like an imaginary shape of a person. Like maybe she's invisible. See how they're like dotted lines? A Bad Case of the Sillies. Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would be crammed with thousands screaming kids scurrying to their rooms, but now it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story and toward the 20th. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story, and there was no Miss Zarves. Allison didn't understand it. If there wasn't no 19th story, then there wasn't her class really on the 29th? Suddenly she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of their way, but Dee Dee stamped on her foot. Then Ron jammed her stomach. She grunted as she fell and rolled down 3 steps. Dee Dee and Ron didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her windbreaker was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They raced up the stairs, and then when they got to Mrs. Jules's room, they were too pooped to learn anything. Allison thought all the kids in Mrs. Jules' class were silly, even Rondi, and Rondi was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her. That was because Jason didn't like her, or else he loved her. Allison wasn't sure. When she got to class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their heads flat on their desks and their tongues hanging out. You could have said you're sorry, Allison said as she walked past them. They sat up straight in their chair, she sat up straight in her chair, folded her hands on her desk, and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming in it. "Look what I brought," he said. "What's the name of your goldfish?" asked Mrs. Jules. "His name's Shark," said Jason. Let me get this on there. Okay. "Shark," said Jason. Everyone laughed. Allison rolled her eyes. "It makes him feel important," Jason explained. "Where should I put him?" "How about on top of the coat closet," suggested Mrs. Jules. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tiptoes. He held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly, the chair toppled over. "Ah!" Gulp. Jason yelled as he fell on the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down over his wet face. Mrs. Jules hurried back. "Quick, somebody fill the bowl with water," she said. "Where's Shark?" Jason made a face. "I swallowed him." The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell and told everybody to settle down. "You have a bad case of the sillies this morning," she said. She took roll. "Who's absent?" she said. "Allison," said Rondi. "Very funny, Rondi," said Allison. "Anybody besides Allison?" asked Mrs. Jules. "I'm here, Mrs. Jules," said Allison. She sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jules couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in the class. "Just Allison," said Mrs. Jules. She marked it on her green roll card. "Damien, will you please take the roll card to the office?" Allison stood up. "But I'm not even absent," she said. Damien took the roll card and walked out of the room. "Mrs. Jules, did you just mark me absent?" asked Allison. Mrs. Jules didn't answer her. Allison marched up to her desk. "Mrs. Jules, did you mark me absent?" she asked again. Mrs. Jules looked up. "Terrence, what are you whispering about?" "Nothing," mumbled Terrence. "If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me," said Mrs. Jules. "Get off my case, buzzard face," said Terrence. "Terrence!" exclaimed Mrs. Jules. "Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." "But that's what I said to Jenny," Terrence protested. "Mrs. Jules, what about me?" Allison demanded. Mrs. Jules ignored her. Allison screamed as loud as she could. Mrs. Jules didn't hear her. Allison faced the class. "Can't anybody see me?" she asked. Nobody answered her. "Rondi," shouted Allison. "Dana? Jason?" "This isn't funny," said Allison. "I know you're all just pretending." She stood right in front of Jason, leaned over his desk, and stared him straight in the eye. "I know you can see me," she said. "You're trying not to laugh." He just stared right through her. She stuck out her tongue at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to lick his nose. "Yuck!" she exclaimed, then wiped her tongue on her sleeve. Mrs. Jules began the morning lesson. "Have you gone crazy?" shouted Allison. She ran out of the room and down to the class on the 29th story. "Come quick," she said. "There's something wrong with Mrs. Jules's class." Nobody heard her. She slammed the door, then continued down the stairs to the class on the 28th floor. No one saw her there either. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Is the whole school playing a joke on me?" she wondered. "It's not funny." She shouted as loud as she could. She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that came to her head, hoping that someone somewhere would notice her. "Fish for sale! Fresh fish! Fat fish! Get your fresh fat fish!" A tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of one of the classrooms. "Shh," she whispered. "This is a school, not a fish market." "You can hear me?" asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug her. "Yes, I can hear you," said the woman sternly. "My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible for us to get any work done." "I'm sorry," said Allison, "but something's wrong in Mrs. Jules' class." "You'd better come in here," said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her room. "What's your name?" the teacher asked her. "Allison. Boys and girls, this is Allison," the teacher announced to her students. "She'll be joining our class." "What?" said Allison. "But—" "My name is Miss Zarb," said the teacher. "Welcome to the 19th story." What do you think? That was that gets you thinking, you know. Is there a 19th story and maybe the whole Wayside School can't see it? And maybe Allison is the only one in the class that can see it? Why can't the class see Allison? But Ms. Zarves can. There is no 19th story. There is no Ms. Zarves. Oh, what a confusing chapter. All right, but you know what? I love how creative that chapter was. All right, so that was chapter 19, A Bad Case of the Sillies. And now we know why she looks invisible. All right, so tomorrow when I read, actually I'll be reading Monday because I take the weekend off. Chapter 19 is called A Wonderful Teacher. So we'll probably get to see a little bit more of Allison in that chapter. Find out, yes, we'll find out what Ms. Zarv's class is about on Monday. And then we'll probably read chapter 19, which is called Forever is Never. And Allison is still on this one, and we don't know why she has socks on her ears. So we'll see what those chapters are about on Monday. All right, guys, have a great weekend. Say goodbye to Finn. Come here, buddy. Come here, say goodbye. Say goodbye. Oh, what a good boy. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.